And there we have it. We are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream conversation here for What If Cinema. My name is Nick Cooey, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Sergio Martinez Esqueda. I'm here in Minneapolis. Sergio is back in Mexico. How are you doing over there, Sergio?
I'm good, and you, Nick?
Oh, fabulous! I'm really actually quite excited for today because we're being joined by a really exceptional curator, someone who we've worked with before in the past on other projects, but who has done an immense body of work already as a curator. She's worked with several festivals, including Open City Documentary Festival, Ficción No Ficción at the Cinemateca de Bogota, as well as the Porto Postdoc Festival. And she's produced independent documentaries for HBO, Vice, The New Yorker, The Atlantic. The list goes on and on. And the person that we're introducing is Emily Wright, who is situated right now in London, if I'm not mistaken. How's it going, Emily?
Hey, how is everyone? I'm good. Thank you for the invite.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. And and here on What If Cinema, we like to talk a lot with our guests about cinephilia because we are all cinephiles in some way. And so I guess I wanted to kind of open with asking you a little bit about your roots of cinephilia, because you grew up in Portugal, and I was just curious: was your family growing up in Portugal a very film-centric household, or did cinephilia that came to you a little later then?
No, I mean, it came to me, but not through my family. It came to me, I think, as being a sort of moody teenager in rural Portugal and wanting to be distracted by the prospects. So it came to me through the school library. And a one teacher I had in specific who sort of was like, maybe you should start watching some more films, and introduced me to the sort of shelf that was world cinema, which was very small, but I probably rewatched things countless times, and then eventually started looking at other outlets and sources. But yeah, so it came to me through the school and the teacher that I'm still in touch with. So yeah.
Well, that's fabulous. And were there any particular films that were really quite revelatory during that period of discovery for you?
I mean, I watched Haneke's the Pianist when I was far too young, at like 14 or something. So that's one thing to call revelatory for sure. But no, I think it was there were lots of titles, lots of Portuguese titles as well. That I, sort of came to a lot of the work of Manuel de Oliveira, which is quite a somber sort of filmmaker to get into quite young, but I guess it was what there was. I think he was a big influence early on.
That's fabulous. And then branching out from that, then so what was it about Oliveira's work? And of course, we've had conversations before that another Portuguese filmmaker, Pedro Costa, has been he's left a huge impression on you. What is it about those particular filmmakers that has really captured your imagination?
I think with Oliveira, I think there's like a sort of theatricality to it. It's rooted in a text. So I studied literature then at university, so I'm also quite interested in sort of literary filmmaking that feels quite literary. And then I think Pedro Costa, there's a lot. I could spend probably a podcast speaking about him or his work. And I think with him, there's a real sort of sense of a realism, but then also it draws from this whole history of cinematic language, right? And his interest in sort of old classics and like Tourneur and Ford and all these people that it was via his work that I got introduced to a lot of those films. So it's weird in a way. I think those two filmmakers opened up the doors to cinema a little bit for me in quite oblique ways, I guess.
Yeah, it's the holy trinity of Haneke, Oliveira, and Costa. Sounds like getting some ideas now for Christmas viewing. But I'm thinking then, so you started out with that sort of foundation, and then you moved out to Latin American cinema, and when you were living in Colombia. Tell us a little bit about kind of that transition, how you got to stay in Colombia and live there, and what the work was like out there.
Like I mentioned, I'd studied literature at university, but I realized that was very interested in moving image. I was very quite politically active, I guess, at that time as well. So I was looking for something that sort of felt like it didn't go against my values or my belief system. And I think documentary was something that that really provided, you know, it brought these two things together, like a love for storytelling that I got from the films and the literature, but then also like I guess an interest in social concerns. And I worked for a production company in London for a little bit, but wanted to sort of make my own stuff. And I spoke to my boss, and he was like, sort of just go away, make films, and you know, if it doesn't go well, I'll give you your job back. So it was an incredible blessing. And then I moved to Colombia because, and will bring us full circle towards later to the grad project, because I've always been quite interested in like belief systems and the way that people sort of have quite strong beliefs or like ideology, and so I was kind of quite interested in Colombia and the FARC, the like Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And I thought it was an interesting time for the country in terms of transitioning towards peace. And I thought it would be an interesting time to go there and sort of try and do a bit of freelance work. And that's how I moved to Colombia. And so then I moved there and I started making films. But I didn't really feel like filmmaking was quite right for me, which was then when I decided to try and curate. I was really influenced by my editor at the time, this editor called Juan Soto, who's a real cinephile, and he was like, you're kind of a cinephile at heart. You know, maybe you should think about sort of exploring that a little bit more. And so that's when I founded Ficción No Ficción, and did with a friend of mine, Isabel Cuadros, and we did the first showcase, which was and so far the only showcase, unfortunately, because of COVID. But it was we brought together the work of two filmmakers, and that really sort of, I kind of didn't really look back after that, and applied to the same MA that you guys have done, and then moved back to London. So that was kind of how I ended up in Colombia, and that's also how I got used to sort of, or got introduced to this like wealth of Latin American cinema, I guess through the language as well.
That's really interesting because for the people, this special episode is about transnational cinema, and we think that Emily is a great example of programming work in this transnational context. So, Emily, I mean, we know that you came from a background from, I will say, different backgrounds from Portugal, the UK, but now talking about Colombia. All of these has a kind of result in your cinephilia, but also in your work, in your own interest. And how would you put all of this in I mean, as experience, as a background in your work right now? You're almost you're about to graduate from the NFTS as a programmer. How all of these transnational experiences are part of your professional work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it kind of manifests itself in a bunch of different ways. I think in a way, sort of having such a sort of random background, I guess, through growing up in different places, living in different places, being introduced to, like you put it, sort of quite unusual, perhaps, corners of cinema, as opposed to the sort of like established canon. I think it has really driven home something that I feel very strongly now, which is about this idea of the curator as someone who needs to be expansive in their research because of the sort of quite gatekeeping nature of the work that we do. I think that we have a responsibility to look for filmmakers and work from countries that maybe industries don't promote themselves as well as, say, the US film industry promotes itself. So I think that's sort of really been sort of a bit of a guiding value, I guess, in when I think about curating seasons or programs or showing films. It's sort of a lot of it's to do with how can I introduce the work of a filmmaker I really love or respect to an audience. How do you create the context where that then becomes sort of something they might engage with? So I think that's one way that that I'd say sort of my background has informed my my I guess my curatorial practice. I think also then in terms of interest, it's definitely sort of introduced me randomly to a very specific type of cinema, which is this like hybrid documentary fiction form, which seems to be quite prevalent in Spanish speaking and Portuguese speaking countries, like in Portugal, or I've been thinking and watching a lot around the Galician New Wave, which is very much a sort of like hybrid fiction, non-fiction format. Ficción Non-Ficción was a festival or like a showcase that I founded precisely because I was interested in that sort of that weird in-between space, which I think has now become quite established, right? And it was looking at festivals like Frames of Representation or Art of the Real at the Lincoln Center. There were festivals that I was really excited by and was like, can I do something similar in Bogota? And so yes, I think it's maybe manifest through how the values I have perhaps when I think of curating stuff, but also just the nature of the type of things I'm curating, because I do think it always comes back to some kind of relationship with the real, and those cinemas from those countries are quite are in dialogue with that quite a lot, I guess.
Yeah, and I will also say that being multilingual or having different languages, I don't know if I'm right, but you speak English, Portuguese, Spanish, and I feel that also has a kind of an impact in your, even in while watching a film. It has some kind of impact if you recognize the language that you are hearing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it also maybe has, I mean, one of the things I kind of love about programming or film curation and festivals and all that is it does feel very sort of like a big international community, and people share random interests across boundaries. But you're right, I do think speaking multiple languages definitely sort of helps that, because I could found a sort of like I could start a showcase in Bogota because I could speak the language, and I made, I met colleagues that wanted to start it with me. And I could, for example, the work I'm doing with Porto Postdoc is, it's amazing because I always wanted to work in Portugal again, having moved away from there quite a few years now. And I think that definitely comes down to me I got that job partly because of, I wrote a case study on the festival as part of my MA. And then they were like, oh, the case study is really interesting, and you speak Portuguese. It was kind of like two and two together, and I guess it just really made sense for them to get me on board. So yeah, I think having a couple of languages really, really has helped me without a doubt.
Right, and I mean, and then as well, but of course, like as somebody who's collaborated with a very broad international range of curators as well, the challenge as well as being a curator, as you very well know, and as I think many of us know, is that there is a limitation in terms of our knowledge and in terms of what our specialism is. And so when you are programming a festival or something, or some sort of a season, how have you collaborated with other individuals or curators to sort of help you sort of maybe cover some of the blind spots that you might have as a curator or a programmer?
Yeah, well, I think, I think I really enjoyed collaboration. Like I started Ficción Non-Ficción with Isabel because I really wanted to collaborate with someone. And Isabel had like a wealth of knowledge of not so much actually the type of cinema we wanted to make it about, because she was like, I really want to learn more about it. So that was maybe my specialism there. But like she had a knowledge about sort of very practical things of a local film industry that's fascinating to get to know, right? And I think we also sometimes think it's the same everywhere, and it really isn't, you know, in terms of sort of the rights or, you know, theatrical windows, all these things change a lot depending on what territory you're in. But I think, yeah, whenever I feel like I have a bit of I want to know more, or I have a bit of a gap in my knowledge, I genuinely will try and reach out to someone. I think obviously I don't overdo it because people's time is precious. And it's good to sort of not abuse that. But no, definitely. I also think it's something in terms of collaboration, like I really, and maybe this comes from my background in filmmaking, but I really enjoy being in conversation with the filmmakers that I program a lot. So like even, for example, with Fiction, Nonfiction, we brought over 2 of the filmmakers, and it was really nice to have them there and to see how the program worked. With my grad project, I'm probably chatting to about half or maybe 70% of the filmmakers that I'm showing, because it's kind of like it's nice for them to know, I guess, you know, the context into which their film's being programmed. But I also think it's nice as a programmer to sort of be able to have conversations with the people whose work you're sort of trying to introduce to an audience. So yeah, I really enjoy collaboration, definitely.
That's excellent. And you just briefly touched upon some of your filmmaking work. And as we noted at the beginning of the episode, you've edited documentaries for a number of journalistic publications. And I was curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that, and how specifically also your interest in belief systems has informed your work editing documentaries, and how that possibly overlaps with some of your curatorial work.
Yeah, so I mean, my filmmaking work has been, mainly been in Colombia, and I have a production company as well with a friend who I met out there, and so we do kind of like a 2-person team. I do a lot of the development, and then the edit production, which is where you sort of like make the story work in terms of putting different voices, interviewed voices, in conversation, and then I hand it over to an editor. I don't do much of the editing myself at all, but I think in terms of, like, I don't know, moving to being interested in belief systems, that stems from perhaps growing up in Portugal and the Catholic religion, and one being at odds with that as a moody teenager in the library. So I think I did. It's a weird tension, I think, that's always, and it's just funny, right, where you see yourself drawn to similar themes and you think they're not connected, and then many years later you're like, oh, they are. And I think in Colombia, probably that was expressed the most when I made a documentary about 3 generations of women who were all in the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia from the same family. So it was mother and 2 daughters from different generations, and it was kind of how, like, intergenerational trauma sort of how it had affected them, but then also how, I guess, the cycle of violence repeats itself, and what would it take to break that when you believe so firmly in an ideology? What would it take to sort of, like, the mother came out, but then the youngest daughter went in, and it's like, what does it take to break those things? And the film doesn't provide an answer because I don't think there is one. But yeah, so that was sort of that was, I guess, the way those themes got expressed the most in my filmmaking work. And then when I was thinking about ideas for my grad project, it took a long time for me to actually even make that connection, because I came at it from a very different angle that was all about this interest in the figure of, like, well, it's still about belief, but a different type of, the figure of Cassandra, and how she's quite a prescient, the mythological figure, right? Like, she's quite a prescient archetype of the times, of this person who knows what's happening to the world, is talking about it, but no one's paying attention to them. And I read this, like, New York Times think piece about how we're living in the age of Cassandra, or some sort of quite sensational title, but something about it really stuck with me. So I was looking at ways that films could express this, and it's obviously very narrow and quite niche, so then I had to sort of pull it out a little bit. But this idea of, like, I guess, belief in disaster, when you're sort of, you know, what does it take you to believe something's going to happen? What does it take you to sort of disbelieve someone who says something might happen? So yeah, lots of ideas that kind of overlap, I guess.
Right. I mean, it sounds very complex, and but it actually, but it's got some really remarkable films as well. That including one that is having its premiere in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. And what were some of the logistics in terms of acquiring that title for your program?
Well, that was very much like it a title I guess I'd been tracking, I guess, for quite a long time. Like, I saw it premiered at Berlinale. I watched it through my work at Porto. I really loved the title. I thought it was like an astonishing debut film. It's really beautiful. And hadn't really considered it for my grad project at all, but it really stayed there with me. And because at that point I wasn't even thinking about my grad project that much anyway. And then it was probably in the summertime that I really started thinking, like, this is a really good fit, and it's quite a sort of oblique way into it. I mean, that's kind of the point of the program anyway. And then it started doing very well. It started to sort of premiere at quite, like, I think at TIFF it won an award, and then it showed at New York Film Festival, and then Open City went by, and it hadn't been picked up by Open City because I guess it's not a documentary. And then London Film Festival went by, and it hadn't sort of shown at London Film Festival. And then I was like, the only place it could Berwick had gone by, and it hadn't shown at Berwick. And I was like, the only place it could really show is Frames of Representation. And I was like, and even then I was like, it's probably still too much of a sort of not enough grounded in nonfiction, in reality, for it to be to show there. So then I just wrote to the filmmaker and sort of explained my season and said that I really wanted to show her film, and, you know, explain my reasons behind it. And she's like, yeah. And so and it was never like that it had to be the UK premiere, because I'm not at all caught up with those sort of labels. I think they're useful labels to maybe get an audience in, but I don't actually. I'd still show, if the film had showed at London, I still would have shown it again. Do you know what I mean? It was sort of like, it's like just another opportunity for an audience to get to see that film. But I am just really delighted that a London audience are going to get to see it on the big screen. Like, it makes me really happy, because it's a film that also should be experienced on a big screen. It's like a very penumbral film, and it's shot on 16mm, and all these like flashes and flares of the camera. You can really feel the like artifacts of the filmmaking process on the film itself. So it's a really good one to go to the cinema and experience. So so we're showing hers, and then we're also, which was very exciting, showing what ended up being again a UK premiere of the short film by the Mexican Colectivo Los Ingrávidos. And so their latest experimental short, which showed at a place in Norway, and then the next screening will be with my grad project, which is exciting. So I'm very happy. It's also beautiful. It's a mad work, but really beautiful. Very important.
That's great, Emily.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up also the because I haven't seen really any of the shorts that are featured in your grad project, but I did watch the other night the feature film and as we were talking maybe briefly right before we started this episode, what you've called the most accessible film in some ways of your season, which is This Is Not a Burial, It's a Resurrection. And that's also really interesting in the way that film has a very tactile aesthetic as well, in terms of its super 16mm photography. And that's used to capture this really interesting relationship between the land and the sky, and the people of this village that is due to be demolished to make way for a dam. And of course, like that taps into some very deeply spiritual and cultural questions about identity and belonging and history, and how that's also tied up into politics inescapably. And I was curious to hear you sort of talk about maybe your relationship with that film, with the filmmaker, and why you settled on that as, I suppose, the most accessible film of the season.
Well, yeah, I mean, I always knew that, like, straight from the beginning, that I wanted to show something by Lemahan, Jeremiah Moses. I think his work's really beautiful. It really spoke as well to, like, the core themes of the program. Um, and it was just deciding which one, between this one or Mother, I'm Suffocating. This was my last film about you, which he, I think, premiered maybe the same year, or no, the year before, at Berlinale. And then I settled on this one because it was like thematically, it just sort of worked a little bit more with the program. But yeah, I think it's I always wanted it to be part of the season. I always wanted it to be the first film in the season. I knew that from the start. I think it's a really good first film, precisely because it's sort of there's a narrative. It's still narrative filmmaking, and there's a story that people can sort of hold on to, whilst there is also an amazing visual language, right? The visual language of that film is really quite impressive. And I also thought there was something about, in the film's visual language, where even though there is a narrative, it does draw from experimental film, like an experimental film lexicon a little bit. So that would make sense that then people, if they saw that and enjoyed that, they'd maybe give some of the more experimental work a go, because it wasn't completely on the other end of the spectrum either, It sort of definitely felt like it was mining some of these similar sort of creative strategies that some of the other filmmakers maybe do in a more austere way. But yeah, it existed in that work. So I always knew I kind of wanted to show that film. And then I'm also very interested I guess, in terms of just curation, I'm very interested in the possibilities of combining a short with a feature, and what that does in terms of sort of like, especially with a season, right? And so I'm showing that with Eileen Gockman's Spirits and Rocks, and Azorian Myth, and it's about a very different community in the Azores that have to live with this constant tension between a volcano that might erupt and but also makes their land very fertile. And so there's a similar sort of community at the center that are having to deal with this sort of possibility of a disaster, and a possibility of a disaster that has been written into the land for a very long time, because this is not a burial. You also have the figure of a storyteller, sort of the griot, who is constantly talking about wars and plagues and quite biblical language, drowned cities that you never quite know if it's sort of in the past, or if it's a premonition towards the future, whether he's speaking from the past or whether he's speaking from the future, looking back on what happened to this community. So I thought there was a nice, interesting sort of overlap there that would hopefully really introduce people to what the program was about, and then they could come back for some of the maybe more experimental offerings, like the collections of shorts, right? Which are maybe a bit more challenging, but equally rewarding, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting that you just singled out the biblical connotations of the story of that film as well, which is also very much about this complex relationship with the legacy of Christianity in Lesotho, and the way that is an appurtenance of colonialism. But the film is not simply painting it in a good or bad dichotomy. It's actually trying to sort of tap into a lot of nuances, while at the same time articulating a lot of the toxicity of these power structures, which have transformed over time as well. And I mean, I think that's really interesting, when you have something that's grappling with complex history. I mean, and that film is also very much drawing upon the history of cinema in terms of its casting of the lead actress, who the name escapes me at the moment, but of course she was a very well-known actress, and this was her final role. And that gives the film even more of a poignant weight to it, as we watch this heroine, try to defend what is ostensibly her dying town.
Completely. And I think that was also the one title that carried over sort of from this idea of the figure of Cassandra telling us to not believe something. And that was kind of the one title, the film that sort of I'd initially thought of during that iteration of the program. And then when I thought of this new, slightly broader one, the film carried through, because like you just mentioned, there are all these other themes that it speaks to. Definitely.
That's great, and that's really great that you took the element of Cassandra and you transposed that onto this slightly revised version of the program that you're about to screen. And of course, as a programmer, as curators, we constantly have to work with revisions in terms of having to accept, okay, we're not able to acquire these films because the materials are not in ideal condition or because of rights issues. And so how do you, as a programmer, sort of work with that sort of flexibility whilst at the same time retaining a clarity of vision in terms of what you want to do for your project?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge. I'm not going to lie. I think it really is. I think there's a challenge as well. I don't particularly want to do programming that feels didactic either. Do you know what I mean? Where you feel like you're imposing a meaning on the films too much. And I think I'm much more interested in sort of like programming that feels a little bit ambiguous or that opens doors as opposed to sort of closing on meanings. And I think that in itself then is a completely other challenge, because how do you do that in a way that doesn't then completely alienate an audience, right? Because at the end of the day, we're programming for an audience, we're not programming for ourselves, as much as it's sometimes tempting to. But no, I think I think it's I think it is a real challenge. I do, because I think, especially even with this program, if certain titles fall through, it's not like you're sort of drawing off, a huge group of potential titles. It's already quite small, so every title can really make a difference. And I think that's perhaps why sort of a lot of the titles I've got them through cultivating a bit of a relationship with the filmmaker, because it felt so crucial to have them in, that it wasn't as easy as sort of just writing to a distributor, even though there was some of that as well, but like just writing to a distributor being like, I've got X amount of money, can I please take the title? It's not as simple perhaps as that.
If only it were.
What?
If only it were.
I know, if only it were. No. But yeah, no, it has been a challenge. It's been a big learning curve as well, which is really, I think, is always important. I always wanted my grad project to sort of be about sort of pushing myself and learning more and trying to, and I think this is definitely, there's been moments when I've regretted going for something quite so conceptual and obscure, but hopefully it will all be fine in December. I think it will.
Oh, I'm sure it will. I mean, it sounds like a great project, and of course, if Sergio and I were in London, we would absolutely be going to the close-up, because
absolutely, yeah,
they're a wonderful venue, and it's important that we continue having these venues as well, which are taking a chance on screening these sorts of works, because during the pandemic, as well, it's made film exhibition, I mean, that much more tenuous. Oh, it's made everything really tenuous. But I mean, in terms of actually giving voice to these independent artists and to enrich the conversation around, particularly independent cinema, it's imperiled it in some respects, while it's at the same time, it's given an opportunity for people to look for other venues of streaming or watching some of these films. I'm not sure if you would agree with that or not, or what your kind of impression of that is.
Yeah, no, I'd agree completely. I think it's, I think Close Up a wonderful venue and a wonderful resource as well. I mean, because they're a library, so in a way I'm going back to the beginnings of my cinephilia, being my interest in cinemas. But no, they're a wonderful venue. They're incredibly supportive. I think they're a really good resource for audiences and filmmakers alike, I think. And I think for programmers and curators, they're very generous with their space and what the way they open it up to different festivals or collectives or individual programmers. And like you say, there's always a risk incurred, right? So it's not like they open up to anyone. There is a bit of a vetting process, but I think they definitely aren't risk averse, which I think has become increasingly when you're competing with the streaming platforms, when you're competing with bigger cinemas that are doing sort of blockbuster releases at the moment to get bums on seats. I think it's a bit of a rarity to sort of not be risk averse in the current climate. And I think Close Up really does take a risk still, and has quite a loyal following because they do that.
Mm-hmm. I was, all this talk about the library and the necessity of what sounds like education in terms of how that's informed your curatorial practice. I was wanting to kind of maybe branch that into talking a little bit about some of your work as a lecturer, because I know you've spoken at CUNY in the past and at other institutions. Tell us a little bit about that and what that's sort of entailed.
Yeah, I mean, actually, most of the times I've spoken at universities was off the back of doing stuff with the films I made, because the films, I guess, tapped into quite like social issues that were quite relevant. So like the times that we spoke at, I spoke at Rutgers, that was a lot about sort of documentary filmmaking practice with social concerns from Latin America, or the New School as well. And so it's kind of been more from that side of things than the curatorial side. I would say it's definitely been more about would often show the film. Sometimes would have, one or two of the subjects with us as well, and then sort of like lead a discussion about what it is, and also a lot to do with the ethics of sort of documentary filmmaking as well.
Yeah.
Which again is probably why I think like going into when I started curating, there was definitely like an ethical concern around what type of films are getting platformed and shown and which ones are getting forgotten or left to the wayside a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, and I mean, there are myriad considerations to be taken into account when it comes to the ethics in terms of filmmaking or curation when it comes to the truth. And I mean, of course, one of those is especially when there's this whole delineation between reality and fiction, of trying to not screen work or make work that aestheticizes suffering and aestheticizes really socioeconomic disparity in the world. And so as a programmer, how do you continue to try to sort of be wary of that and to make sure you don't succumb to that trap?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a difficult one because I think concepts and labels like truth and, the real, all that are so sort of, I mean, ever since the first documentaries were made, right? It's sort of, that's been like it's a contentious term ever since. You look at like the work of like Flaherty and all that. It was like Flaherty called it sort of actuality as opposed to documentary, and I think he called documentary the creative treatment of actuality, and I think that's something that I hold quite close to me when I think of documentary films. It isn't necessarily a doc, and that's probably why I prefer the term nonfiction. It's like it's not a document per se, it's like the creative treatment of something, because ultimately it's always going to be a creative treatment. As soon as I'm a person with my own, I'll filter it through my own prejudices, through my own perception, right? And so so but I do think it's hard because I think there is definitely work that does that. There's definitely, and you can tell it, I think, quite quickly, the intention of a filmmaker. Because I think then there's another piece. You could look at something like Dirty Feathers, which is a recent film by, his name escapes me, but it was produced by Roberto Minervini. He was the producer on it. It's going to screen at Frames, I think. Frames the representation. But you look at something like that, and that's a film that sort of really does toe the line between sort of potentially doing it, but then it is also like maybe giving these stories that are normally marginalized or normally treated in a certain way the cinematic experience as well. Like it's sort of like I guess it's sort of upholding them to that standard, which is also quite a generous act. So I think it's a really tricky area, and I don't think there's a sort of a code that you can follow to that obviously there are certain things you shouldn't show, but I think there's a bit of ambiguity around it, and you then just need to do what you feel comfortable with, and also what the program demands. Like if you have context to perhaps sort of like frame it in a certain way, then that's one thing. If you don't have that at all, then you need to probably err on the side of caution a lot more.
Right. Right. And it's so interesting that you've just singled out Minervini as well, because one of the major characteristics of his filmmaking, and he's not alone in this, I'm thinking Pedro Costa would do this as well, is that he has a very close relationship with the subjects of his nonfiction work. And that, of course, some of the films do toe the line between these fly-on-the-wall observations, but of course they're very carefully curated in a lot of respects. And and there's something really powerful to be said about how these nonfiction works. What maybe might distinguish them from something that is more exploitative or problematic, we could say, is that sense of collaboration which exists between the filmmaker and the subject. And that relationship, could very well, of course, also extend to the curator and the filmmaker, or the curator and the subjects, even though there's no direct relationship, but it's much more indirect still.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think collaboration really underpins, like, I think luckily we're starting to let go of this idea of sort of like within documentary film that if you like collaborate with the subjects, then you're not getting a sort of, you're getting a biased form of truth or whatever it is, that they might be sort of changing their stories because all of a sudden you've given them the possibility to do it. I really don't believe in that idea at all. And I think that's a bit of a fallacy around documentary filmmaking that kind of needs to be let go of. But because I think collaboration definitely engenders much richer work, without a doubt. When people also feel somewhat in control of how they're being presented to the world, I think also means they're more invested in it as well. And Roberto Minervini does that without a doubt, and so does Pedro Costa, and so does, for example, one of the filmmakers I sent in my streaming recommendations, which was Camilo Restrepo. And he's a really fascinating filmmaker because he's a filmmaker that, in a way, his films have something that feels very non-fiction, not non-documentary about them, but they couldn't be more anti-realist. They really couldn't, because it's sort of and he sort of says, like, for him, it's not about framing reality, it's about exploding the frame so that we look at reality from a different point of view altogether. And that's sort of an intention I find quite interesting. So so that's why hybrid's is an interesting area, because you can get away with a lot. You're not sort of cornered into sort of what a documentary film should be or what a fiction film should be. You can kind of sort of, I feel filmmakers can sort of cherry pick what works best for them.
Sergio, do you have any questions about?
Not questions, but just comments on this kind of hybrid filmmaking. And I don't know, I feel it's very, very, I feel that we're living in a kind of moment for that. Alonso Ruiz Palacios just released una película de policías. It's on Netflix, you should watch it. And it's a very, very interesting kind of hybrid fiction documentary. Because, of course, I mean, what I like about una película de policías is that it centers in the fiction, I mean, in the script, and from that it takes several things from the real, from the documentary, not documentary as a genre, but as a kind of a form, a form of exploring the themes, which are policemen here in Mexico and the whole trouble with corruption and all of that. So I think it's very interesting what we are seeing right now with so many hybrid films.
Yeah, no, I agree. And a cop movie, the película de policías, is a really good. And also I think that starting to be embraced a bit more by the mainstream, like
exactly.
The fact that it's on Netflix. Where you look at the new film by Robert Greene, who Procession, that's coming out on Netflix, I think this week or next week or something like that. So they're filmmakers that were using this quite experimental technique of sort of like, how do you mash the two things that for a long time have been, or not even a long time, that's always existed, right? Agnes Varda's first film is arguably a docu-fiction, but how do you mash these two things together and present them to a mainstream audience? And I think these films they're really being embraced because they also sort of allow for a bit more ambiguity, a bit more question. And creatively, you can probably get away with a bit more as well. So, but yeah, it's a cop movie is a really interesting film.
No, and I love that you single out Robert Greene, because he's also a filmmaker who's been very interested in making these films which are docu hybrids as well, and they're not even necessarily, like, for example, I'm thinking something like Bisbee 18, which is it's about a particular subject, and yet it's a meta commentary. It's not because it is about a small town of who is recreating the events that happened in their town 100 years prior, and so it's not even really about the event itself as much as about the way history is inscribed in the present. It is the relationship between past and present, and I'm thinking as well, like, and that's not limited to kind of the documentary genre as well. I mean, you see it in filmmakers like Lucrecia Martel, for example, what she was doing with Zama, the way that she retained a lot of historical verisimilitude in terms of the aesthetic and the costuming, but at the same time, she transforms the past into looking very alien. Almost, it reminds me a little bit of like what Jim Jarmusch did for the Western with Dead Man in some ways.
Or I mean, what she says, I think, is like that the past is as alien to us as science fiction, like, because it's so far away, and yet we've read a certain narrative onto it. We've read like an official narrative onto it. And I think what that film does is kind of like cracks that official narrative and says, actually, there were all these other stories underneath it that just didn't get written down by whoever was in power. And that's kind of, I think, at least to me, what that film does. It's like she speaks about it sort of like the past needing to be invented because the invention we've sort of like settled on is not really the right one. And it's sort of led us to this sort of like, you know, to sort of this world where we are now.
So then I guess branching out into curation, is that, in your opinion, the primary duty of curators is to help sort of complicate or make more complex that historiography, that narrative which has persisted over these centuries?
No, I'd definitely say so. I'd say that if you can use, you know, you can use like different films to sort of not use them, but like if different films can sort of work as like portals for conversations around, or like, you know, and give a different angle on a subject, that's a very valuable thing to do. So I mean, the work starts perhaps, you know, with the film in and of itself, right? Like, it's amazing that we've got a film like Zama that exists in the world. So it's kind of then figuring out how do you get an audience to see that as widely as possible, and then once it's gone through its first theatrical run, I think it's then how do you program it in the future so that it doesn't just stay within these very niche circles, which hopefully won't happen with Lucrecia Martel, because I mean, she's amazing and she's like a saint from Argentina, so she should be hailed as such. But no, yeah.
And thank God she didn't end up directing the Black Widow movie like Marvel wanted her to.
Yeah.
Then again,
and I think, I mean, talking about docufiction, her new film Chocolat, Chocobar. Sorry, we still don't know what's going to be, but it feels it's going to be a kind of hybrid film, or maybe some kind of more experimentation on her part.
Yeah, I mean, it will be interesting. I think there's like, you can really trace a line from, like, it's like, I think she always speaks about like almost like a line through all her filmography that goes from sort of like Zama up through like the sort of the complicity and the sort of, you know, the middle upper class complicity around all the desaparecidos in Argentina, to this moment where Chocobar, who is this indigenous activist, got killed. Like, I think you can really see there's like a political, you know, there's a real sort of politics and poetics at work within her filmography, and it's all very much connected, I think. I'm really excited about Chocobar. I think it's going to be, I'm really, really excited. And then obviously it also got the money from the Films of Tomorrow, Locarnos thing. So hopefully it'll come fairly soon. We don't have to wait 9 years for it like we had to for Zama.
Well, the fact that also, I mean, before Zama was her previous film The Headless Woman, if I'm
which was 9 years before.
And I mean, The Headless Woman is, I mean, we could spend a whole episode talking about The Headless Woman and just what an amazing accomplishment that is. And that, you know, that, I mean, the one thing I love about that film is just the way that she is, as you've both been pinpointing, the way that she's channeling very clearly and coyly her political convictions and tracing this historical lineage of the complicity of the bourgeoisie in sort of this socioeconomic, in perpetuating these divisions within society. But at the same time, she is also making something of a very unique remake of Carnival of Souls. And of course, so it's like the way that she's imbued her work with a cinephiliac history as much as a political history, I think is just so fascinating. And it's not
and if you think, all of her titles sound like B movies, like The Swamp,
Yeah.
The Headless Woman, The Holy Girl. They all sound like B movies. But...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's great. Well, I mean, I don't know if there are any sort of closing thoughts, but maybe Emily, if you could just tell us, because we've talked about primarily where your season is taking place, but when is your season taking place?
Of course. So so my season's taking place at Close Up, which is a cinema in Shoreditch. And it's taking place between the 10th and the 16th of December. And it's 4 programs. And I guess you could call them sort of combined programs, because the first one is on the Friday the 10th, and This Is Not a Burial with a short, the one I mentioned. And then there's a collection on the Sunday. It's a short film program, which we're trying to be a little bit experimental in the curatorship, because it's like we didn't think that people would come and sit through 2 hours of shorts back to back, but also to get people to pay for a ticket for just an hour is quite a challenge, right? Because things are expensive. So we're doing like a short 40-minute one on a certain set of themes, then with an intermission. And then we're doing an hour on another set of films. So people get, hopefully, on another set of themes. So they're quite different in tone, the 2 shorts program. And you get 2 for the price of 1 if you come to the cinema for the price of 1 ticket. And then it's December the 15th for the Colectivo Los Ingrávidos shorts and Deborah Stratman's The Illinois Parables. And then we close the season with Rainbow Met St. Anne. So hopefully, whoever's listening in London can come to at least one, but come to as many as you can.
Well, and then, I mean, I know that it's a loaded question in some ways, because your attention is just on this project right now, and to let the season go off without a hitch. But what can we expect from you in the future once you're done with your MA?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm very interested in sort of continuing, I guess, working. I've tried to build up working for institutions whose values I respect, and I'd like to continue to do that, be it in the festivals or hopefully getting a bit more of a stable job alongside it would be good, because otherwise the hustle gets quite long. But no, I'll definitely be thinking and working and curating in a very similar field, and I'm brewing hopefully maybe another season for late winter, early spring. So I will.
Great.
Well, we'll definitely have to have you back when that rolls around.
Yeah, but, definitely, without a doubt. Thank you so much for inviting me as well to chat about everything. It was always lovely to speak to you both.
Well, it's been a real joy
Emily.
Talking with you, Emily. And for everyone who is watching and listening, definitely check out The Edge of Belief, which will be at Close Up, and tickets are available to order now. And walk, don't run, or run, don't walk, I should say. I mean, it's winter, so don't run and slip, but All right. Thanks everyone for joining us.